where does this idea come from, and what does stage 0 mean anyway? So in the next 20 minutes, I'll try and tell you the story of channel incision and stage 0, and how we've got to where we are today, which is, I think, in a position now to really dive in and start being more bold about the way that we deal with the problems of channel incision inherited from past river management regimes. In doing so, I'm not at all critical of what's happened in the past. People acted with the best possible of intentions throughout the history of river management. It's just they didn't know what we know now, and we can, I think, do a better job. So where we start is with a fully connected channel floodplain wetland complex, like the one we see here in a lush, well hydrated river valley, where if we look at a cross section, we see a shallow channel, we see the groundwater, the phreatic surface close to the land surface, and we see rich and verdant vegetation on the floodplain because it has sunlight, it has nutrients, and it has water, and those are the three things it needs to flourish. When the channel incises or degrades, then we change not only the nature of the in-channel environment, but the nature of the floodplain as well. And here we see an arroyo, or a degraded incised channel. So this is a particularly severe example, where the channel has scoured out its bed, it's oversteepened its banks, and it's created something closer to a canyon than a river channel. The effect is to disconnect the channel from its floodplain and turn the floodplain into what's called a terrace. And when you do that, you dehydrate it, and you switch from wetland obligate and wetland facultative systems and plants to more upland and dryland and drought-resistant species. So the entire character of the floodplain changes. It stops being a floodplain. Obviously, it's no longer inundated frequently, and the groundwater table is also lowered because we've put a great big drain in the middle of our floodplain so that we can evacuate the winter rainfall that's stored in that floodplain. We can evacuate that really quickly, and our channel might even start to become intermittent or ephemeral. So these are the sorts of impacts that we get when a channel incises or degrades, when it lowers its bed. And throughout the Southeast United States in the 1970s and early 80s, that sort of process was happening endemically. It was happening everywhere. And it attracted the attention of three of the great geomorphologists of that era, Stanley Shum, Michael Harvey, and Chester Watson, who wrote a book on incised channels. And in that book, they set out the morphology and the dynamics and how to control channel incision. And the centerpiece of their approach was the channel evolution model, which we see here in one of the original sketches. And it shows you, this was somewhat back of an envelope. Now, there were 5 stages of evolution. Stage 1 is the undisturbed channel that I showed you in the top slide there. Stage 2, the bed degrades due to imbalance between the sediment input and output. Stage 3, the banks become unstable because they're too high and too steep to stand up, and they start sliding and sloughing under gravity. Stage 4, we blow out the channel sideways, widen it rapidly, and create so much sediment that we actually start to aggregate the bed again. And then finally, in stage 5, we recreate a stable channel, but now it's inset within that great big canyon that we've gouged out of the floodplain through incision and rapid widening. And vegetation starts to recolonize that channel, and we get back to some kind of dynamic equilibrium in the fluvial system. But now we're disconnected from the floodplain, which has become a terrace. And this channel evolution model is great, and it really helped people understand what was going on and why it was so damaging and what to do about it. But after about 15 or 20 years, that model started to be challenged because of historical evidence that suggested that that stage 1 in the model was not actually the natural condition of the river. And this was led by work by Walter and Merritt on the eastern seaboard of the United States, looking at Watts Branch and Seneca Creek and Brandywine Creek and some of the classic sites that were used as references for stream restoration. And what they discovered was that actually these streams were formed in very young sediments from the 1850s and 60s onwards. This was a post-settlement valley fill that happened because of clearance of woods in the uplands and the building of literally thousands and tens of thousands of small dams, hydropower dams, driving water wheels. And in fact, the pre-disturbance channel was buried under that, and that Holocene channel from post-glacial times was quite different to the channels we see today. And it led Walter and Merritt to say that before Europeans settled the area, the streams were small, anabranching channels with extensive vegetated wetlands, nothing like the channel floodplain systems that Leopold Woolman and Miller and other geomorphologists found in the 1950s. But it isn't just European settlers that caused that incision. In fact, the switch from anastomosing to single-thread rivers is a much older phenomenon. And if we go back to the beginnings of rivers in the Cambrian 500 million years ago, what we find is they're nearly all sheet braided. So they don't really have very stable channels at all. And it wasn't until vegetation got going, particularly in the Devonian, that we start to see in the sediment record, and that doesn't lie, meandering and channel braided systems with islands rather than just shifting bars. And then things really kick off in the Carboniferous with gymnosperms, proper trees. And that's when we find in the sedimentary record anastomosed and island braided systems. So was that coincidence that the planforms of rivers metamorphosized, just changed from braiding and single thread meandering into anastomosing when the trees got going? Well, no. And in fact, Davis and Gibling, who did this research and published it in Nature Geoscience, said expansion of tree habitats led to the crossing of a threshold in vegetative control of floodplain and river morphology. So it's the trees that are responsible for these multi-threaded anastomosed or anabranching systems, the trees and shrubs and other vegetation. Now you might say, well, do we see that then? Is that really what rivers are like on planet Earth? And I do suggest sometime when you've got some time to burn and have a cup of coffee in front of you, just do some browsing on Google Earth in areas that haven't been heavily developed by humankind. Big rivers that haven't been messed with, like the Paranara, the Japura, or the Brahmaputra, or Orinoco. And what you'll see is they're anabranching, they're multi-threaded, they're not single-thread meandering channels. And that's because of this interaction between the water and the sediment and the vegetation. But on the other hand, you can point to lots and lots of rivers, hundreds of rivers, that are single-threaded meandering rivers and say, well, you know, they exist too, and they do. That's absolutely true. And the Rhine would be a classic example of a single-threaded meandering river. But it's only that way because we made it so. If we go back in history, what we discover was the Rhine used to be anabranched as well. It's not, largely thanks to the work of one person, Johann Gottfried Tuller. And Tuller, the tamer of the wild Rhine, said when he started, the river was an immense network of interconnecting streams, coves, and marshy hollows. And in fact, his belief was that no stream or river, not even the Rhine, requires more than one riverbed. Well, starting really with that 2008 paper by Walter and Meritz, I began to question whether one stream should only have one riverbed. And during that time, I was on sabbatical leave with Brian Kluwer of the National Marine Fisheries Service, and he's a light aircraft pilot, and we flew around the West quite a lot together, and we started noticing that in the valleys that hadn't been developed, the streams were in fact anabranching multi-threaded systems. And that led us to rethink the channel evolution model. And in 2013, we published a paper on the stream evolution model that tried to recognize that perhaps the model needed a bit of a brush up and update in light of this new evidence. We wanted to keep the original numbering system of Shum, Harvey and Watson, but remember stage 1 in their model was already incised. They didn't know that, but we know it now. So we had to have a stage that came before stage 1, and we called it stage 0. And that's exactly all stage 0 is. It's the multi-threaded anastomosing system that existed prior to incision and the kicking off of the cycle of incision and recovery. Now, the other thing that Brian brought to this that was highly original was to evaluate the benefits and hydrological attributes and geomorphic attributes of systems and how these change during incision. So what we see in the pie charts are hydrological and geomorphic attributes and habitat and ecosystem benefits. And in stage 0, we pretty much maximize these. And so the pie charts are big because we've got rich abundance, and they're also multicolored because we have complex systems with multiple attributes and multiple benefits. But as we incise, we lose a lot of the benthic, the bed attributes and ecosystem services. And as we widen, we wipe out the riparian ones as well. And so when we get to stage 4, we've got very, very heavily degraded ecosystem services. But the good news is, as we move through the later stages and grade the system, we get some of those back. Now, in terms of restoration, then, we can see a really big difference between stages 1 to 4 and 5 to 8, and even stage 0. And we want to be restoring rivers to conditions above that red line, not below. Otherwise, we're locking systems into a fairly parlous state. Nothing like as productive in terms of primary productivity, in terms of biodiversity as it could be. Now, that's all well and good for ecosystem services, but of course, rivers, especially in the UK and in Europe, have to work hard for a living and provide a lot of other services too, particularly natural flood management. And here, there hasn't been a huge emphasis on this in the United States, but there has in Europe and particularly in the UK. Now, this isn't my slide. This is a slide from DEFRA, from Claire Dennis, of the Flood and Coastal Restoration Management Strategy. And what we see is a great emphasis here in the floodplain and in channel part of their diagram on river and floodplain woodlands, on floodplain and wetland restoration, on river restoration, on river and floodplain reconnection, on in-channel measures to restore river floodplain connection, on woody dams. Well, all of these things are things that are lost through incision. And the only way to get them back is to reconnect the channel wetland floodplain system and get that biological engine firing again to give us the ecosystem services, including flood management, slowing the flow, and reduction of flood risk in our urban centers. Now, in Claire's diagram, you see that we've got the wiggly line there because, like many other people, she's a bit locked into the single thread meandering channel as being our restoration target. But our thesis is that actually we can do all of those 6 natural flood risk management measures much better in a multi-threaded anastomose system. Now, why is that true? Well, because let's just look at a single thread meandering river here, the South Fork Mackenzie River, during a bankful flow of about 90 cumecs. And it's basically a fire hose. It's basically a hose pipe. You can imagine there with those high velocities, the standing waves, the intense turbulence, very, very few animals can stay in that channel under those conditions. They'll either be flushed downstream or they'll be killed. Now, that shot was taken at an unrestored reach immediately upstream of where Kate Meyer is going to talk about next. And let's look at that same flood in the restored reach. And it's just chalk and cheese. Where we reconnect the floodplain fully, spread the water out, reduce the intensity of the stream power, and we really seriously slow the flow, that's where we can make a difference in terms of downstream flood risks. And we do that through spreading the flow across the floodplain and through the reintroduction of large wood, standing trees and down trees. Those are the two key elements to getting what we need in terms of natural flood management. But it isn't just on the surface. We've also got to remember that floodplains are three-dimensional. And when we reconnect the channel floodplain system, we also rehydrate the alluvial aquifer, the hyperrheic exchange zone, where the river flows underground as well as overground. And reconnection is the best way of achieving that. And you'll hear more about that as well from the people who actually do these schemes, as opposed to me who just talk about them. And when you do that, what you do is you create a home for everything, literally from bugs to bears, if you're rewilding a river, because in that rich, complex mosaic of habitats, there's a home for everything. And we can restore not only the natural flood management functions, but the biodiversity and the primary productivity and the ecosystems that we want. So I'll end by just looking back a bit and then looking forward. And if we say, well, really, restoration got started in the 1990s with the River Restoration Centre in the UK, with the European River Restoration Centre, and schemes like that on the Skern in northeast England, where we did some in-channel work. We did a lot of stable channel design, and we got started. And then during the 2000s, I think we got very enamored with meandering. We did a lot of re-meandering, but we still worked pretty much in channel all the time. We would build riffles out of imported gravel. We would try and create habitat rather than waiting for nature to do it. And through the 2010s, we've got much more into removing weirs and passage barriers, deculverting, daylighting streams, and just starting to get into reconnecting them to floodplains. But the trouble is, this is all taking too long. To be honest, it's time for us to get serious. It's time for us to start being much more bold. It's time to take the training wheels off and engage with river restoration and take it to the next level. Now, that doesn't mean that we go and start to renature the Rhine. We're not going to do that. And I'm not meaning be bold in terms of the scale of the river that we take on. Let's start with small streams, headwater gullies like this one. This was where one of the first stage zeros was done. But the bold action was not to try and put some wood in this or roughen it. It was to take that channel away. It shouldn't be there. Fill it in. Reconnect the system with a small anastomosing network, put large wood to slow the flow, and then let nature take it from there. So let's be bold in partnering with nature, not trying to do everything ourselves, but being watchful and staying engaged, because the project starts when we finish and nature takes over. That's not the end of things, that's the beginning.